Are the 2026 peace talks ending the Ukraine war? Outside the conference rooms, the winter air is still. Inside, the atmosphere is heavier. High-level envoys from Washington, Kiev, and Moscow sit across from one another, surrounded by the ghosts of failed ceasefires and broken treaties. On the surface, there is a negative stability, a military stalemate where neither side can deliver a knockout blow. But beneath the diplomatic pleasantries lies a more cynical reality. A leaked 28-point US-led peace plan is circulating through the halls of power, promising an end to the bloodshed at the cost of Ukrainian sovereignty. The world is watching, but the question is no longer just about who wins the next trench. It is about who wins the peace. Is this the end of the war, or is it merely the sophisticated management of a permanent frozen conflict? In the next couple of minutes, we will look past the headlines to explain the shifting architecture of power in Eastern Europe and why, in 2026, the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't a missile, it's a pen. To understand why diplomacy has suddenly accelerated, we must look at the dirt. By early 2006, the character of the war has fundamentally changed. The era of sweeping maneuvers and lightning-fast breakthroughs is dead. Following the fall of Pokrovsk in late 2005, many predicted a systemic collapse of the Ukrainian fortress belt in Donetsk. It didn't happen. Instead, we have entered an era of micro-advances. To put the current violence into perspective, consider the math of the meat grinder. In the Pokrovsk sector, Russia's most successful axis of 22-6, the average daily rate of advance is a mere 70 meters. For context, during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, Allied forces moved at 80 meters per day. In 1943, during the Leningrad offensive, the Soviet Red Army moved at 1,000 meters per day. World War I trench warfare. This stagnation is the primary driver for the Kremlin's sudden interest in the Geneva Channel. Moscow is using feigned negotiation as a strategic dampener. By remaining at the table, they discourage Washington from providing high-end escalatory capabilities, specifically the Tomahawk missile systems that Kyiv has requested to tip the balance. The goal is simple: use diplomacy to achieve what the infantry cannot. While the front lines are frozen, the technological ecosystem has evolved with terrifying speed. By 2200, Ukraine has achieved something unprecedented: 95% domestic manufacture of its frontline drone fleet, supported by over 1,000 private defense companies. The introduction of the FP5 Flamingo cruise missile, a purely Ukrainian-designed and produced asset, has shifted the strategic calculus. Kyiv is no longer asking for permission to strike deep. They are targeting oil refineries in Smolensk and ports in Novorossiysk, taking up to 40% of Russia's regional refining capacity offline. However, this autonomy has created a rift with the White House. When Ukrainian strikes hit Novorossiysk, they don't just hit Russian targets, they disrupt the flow of Kazakh oil, which is a core American commercial interest. This reveals a cold truth about 22-6. Even as the U.S. brokers peace, its primary incentive is no longer just victory for Ukraine. It is the stabilization of global energy markets. This friction is the backdrop for the Witkoff-Dmitriev 28-point plan. This document, currently the platinum standard for U.S. negotiations, envisions a radical restructuring of Europe, the NATO ban, a permanent constitutional prohibition on Ukraine joining the alliance, the territorial reality, de facto recognition of Crimea and the Donbas as Russian territory. The profit clause: the U.S. would manage $300 billion in frozen Russian assets for 20 years, with 50% of the profits redirected to the U.S. Treasury. To President Zelenskyy, this looks like the Munich Agreement of 1938. To the Kremlin, it looks like a starting point for total victory. While the infantry is measured in meters, the new Ukrainian strategic logic is measured in thousands of kilometers. In late 2025, a new silhouette appeared in the skies over the Russian heartland: the FP5 Flamingo. This is not a hobbyist drone. It is a 6-ton, locally produced cruise missile with a 3,000-kilometer range, enough to reach as far as Novosibirsk. But it isn't just the range that changed the game. It's the 150-kilogram warhead. For context, that is more than double the explosive payload of a U.S. Tomahawk. Ukraine isn't just striking. They are conducting strategic interdiction. The refinery squeeze: by February 2006, Flamingo flocks have systematically targeted the soft underbelly of the Russian state, its hydrocarbon infrastructure. The Volgograd shutdown: in mid-February, a single Flamingo strike took 40% of the Lukoil-owned Volgograd refinery offline. The 500,000 barrel deficit. The International Energy Agency, IEA, confirms that these persistent strikes have cut Russian crude processing by 500,000 barrels a day. This created a fuel famine in the middle of winter. The Kremlin was forced to ban fuel exports entirely to keep its own tanks moving, but the real damage was to the national budget. Every Flamingo costs roughly $500,000 to produce. The refinery units they destroy cost hundreds of millions and take years to replace. This is asymmetric math at its most brutal. But this is where the power dynamics get complicated. In late 2000, Ukraine struck the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, CPC, loading facility near Novorossiysk. This was a strategic masterstroke for Kyiv, but a diplomatic disaster for Washington. Why? Because that pipeline carries 80% of Kazakhstan's oil exports, oil owned by Western majors like Chevron and ExxonMobil. This is the hidden reason for the Geneva talks. The US didn't just come to the table to help Ukraine. They came to the table to stop the flamingo effect from destabilizing the global economy and alienating Central Asian allies. The flamingo gave Ukraine strategic autonomy, but it also gave the US a reason to push for a freeze. The human layer and the math of extinction. To understand why a ceasefire is being discussed with such urgency, in 2002, we must look beyond the military hardware and the energy markets. We must look at the demographic twilight. In geopolitics, territory can be reclaimed, infrastructure can be rebuilt, but a collapsed population is a permanent strategic defeat. By February 2006, Ukraine is facing a crisis that transcends the current war. It is the struggle for its biological future. The statistics are harrowing. Ukraine's population, which stood at roughly 41 million before the 2022 invasion, has plummeted to an estimated 30 to 32 million. This is not just due to casualties. It is a systemic erosion of the social fabric. The birth rate deficit. The birth rate has fallen to one of the lowest in human history. In 2006, Ukraine is recording 1 birth for every 3 deaths. This is a 30% drop since the start of the full-scale war. The refugee paradox. Of the 5.9 million global refugees, a critical mass of women and children have now spent 4 years integrating into European economies. Every month the war continues. The probability of their return drops by another percentage point. The IDP debt trap. Internally, 3.7 million people are living in a state of permanent displacement. The average monthly income for an internally displaced person, IDP, is just $103, while the average rent in safer Western cities has surged to $140. Families are not just choosing between food and medicine. They are burning through their final life savings. This demographic reality creates a hard military ceiling. While Russia has suffered staggering losses, estimated by CIS at 1.2 million killed, wounded, or missing, it has a population base 4 times larger. Ukraine's losses, estimated between 100,000 and 140,000 military fatalities, hit much harder. The negative stability on the front is a direct result of this. Kyiv can hold the line, but it lacks the surplus of young men required for the mass defensive maneuvers of the 20th century. Finally, there is the reconstruction bill. The cost to return Ukraine to its pre-war state is now estimated at $588 billion, nearly 4 times its pre-war annual GDP. Without a return of its working-age population, there is no tax base to service the debt required for this rebuild. This is the quiet pressure in the Geneva conference rooms. For President Zelenskyy, the 28-point plan is a bitter pill. But for a nation staring down the barrel of demographic collapse, a frozen front may be the only way to ensure that there is still a Ukrainian nation left to govern in 2000. Now that we have established the military stalemate, the technological escalation of the flamingo, the economic squeeze, and the demographic crisis, we must project where this leads. In the high-stakes modeling used by groups like Globsec and RUSI, 3 scenarios emerge for the remainder of 2026. Scenario 1, the Korea scenario. The realistic case. This is the negative stability made official. A technical ceasefire is signed under the 28-point framework. Neither side achieves its maximalist goals. Russia keeps the Donbas. Ukraine receives Article 5-like security guarantees from a coalition of the willing, France, UK, Poland, but not formal NATO membership. The front becomes a permanent, militarized border, a new Iron Curtain. Probability high. Scenario 2, the sustained attrition, the worst case. The Geneva talks collapse over the fortress belt in Donetsk. Russia, sensing Ukrainian manpower shortages, launches a massive summer offensive. The war remains kinetic, the energy strikes intensify, and the demographic exit of the Ukrainian people accelerates. This scenario leads to a slow, systemic collapse of the Ukrainian state capacity by 2027. Probability 31%. Scenario 3. The strategic pivot. The optimistic case. The Flamingo strikes on Russian oil infrastructure reach a critical mass. The 46% inflation in Russia triggers localized unrest or a pivot within the Kremlin's elite. Putin, needing to stabilize his own economy before the September State Duma elections, agrees to a withdrawal for sanction relief model. Ukraine regains administrative control of the ZNPP, Zaporizhia nuclear plant, in exchange for a 25-year neutral status. Probability low. As we look toward the early March sessions in Geneva, the expectations must be tempered. The military Keynesianism of Russia and the demographic endurance of Ukraine are two clocks ticking at different speeds. The 28-point plan drafted by Witkoff and Dmitriev is not a roadmap to peace. It is a blueprint for a managed stalemate. We began by asking, who actually benefits from ending this war? In February 2026, the answer is unsettling. The primary beneficiary is not a nation-state, but the global system itself, which is desperate to trade Ukrainian territory for market predictability. Authority is quiet because the truth is uncomfortable. The map of Europe is being redrawn, not by the will of the people, but by the cold math of energy prices, birth rates, and the flight path of a cruise missile. The question for Ukraine is no longer how to win, but how to survive the peace. If you've stayed around till the end, let's know your thoughts in the comments section. See you in our next analysis.